Good afternoon. Today we're meeting with Jim Mulholland, the community builder for the Southeast Neighborhood Development Corporation, located on the southeast side of Indianapolis, near Fountain Square. Good afternoon, Jim. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us about this exciting community in the Send area.
Happy to do it.
Can you tell us something about the Southeast Neighborhood Development Corporation, what its scope is, and what it really does for the southeast side of Indianapolis?
Southeast Neighborhood Development actually began about 30 years ago when neighbors and stakeholders looked around the area and realized that housing was a huge problem. We had good housing stock, but it had decayed over the years. Realtors no longer would sell houses in our neighborhood. Banks were reluctant to loan money. And so people gathered around tables and kitchens and dining rooms and began to talk about what we could do. And the primary focus initially was housing. And that's where Southeast Neighborhood Development began, often using volunteers and eventually availing itself of grants, eventually state and federal dollars, and slowly began to make impact on the housing in this neighborhood.
And what are the boundaries generally of the Send area?
Southeast Neighborhood Development covers an area of about 4 square miles, about 30,000 people. Washington Street on the north, Raymond Street on the south, Madison on the west, and Sherman on the east.
And how old generally is the neighborhood?
Well, the neighborhood really was founded in the late 1800s. Most of the area was platted. It was primarily working middle class families, a lot of tradespeople, a lot of professionals, and a lot of them were immigrants from Germany and Ireland. So for a long time, it was a kind of a core neighborhood for the city and the vitality of the city.
Okay. So within the Send area, there are several different neighborhood associations. Can you describe those just briefly?
There are actually 12 neighborhood associations in the Fountain Square area. And basically those are neighborhoods that kind of face towards the fountain. And that business district is kind of the center of how they understand themselves. Some of those neighborhoods are fairly small, just a few blocks, and some of them are very large. And generally they organize around kind of natural boundaries, interstates and creeks and major thoroughfares. Each neighborhood has its own distinctives, but they share many of the common issues, common problems, and so they're kind of drawn together around those issues.
So yes, it feels like Fountain Square is the heart of the Send area. And I read that it's described as a neighborhood full of paradoxes, of historic yet up and coming, diverse yet united, organized yet nimble. Can you expand on those words?
The neighborhood has, for a long time, had a reputation of being very organized. If you go back 50 or 60 years ago, because it had a lot of those professionals, it had a lot of those working middle class people, they did organize and they worked together quite well. When the neighborhood began to change, fortunately a core of those kinds of people stayed around. One of the more famous ones would be a woman named Helen Fair, who had been a missionary to India and then came back, and this was her neighborhood, and so she was invested in this neighborhood staying strong. So even in the midst of its greatest decline, there was a core of people who really had a vision of what the neighborhood should be. And then as new people came into the neighborhood, they kind of shared that vision, shared that dream, and continued to organize. So I think what makes the neighborhood strong is, more than anything, the people that are committed to living here. They've chosen to live here. This is the place they want to be, and they want to create a quality of life for themselves and for their neighbors and for their children.
So Jim, tell us some of your background of what led up to you being the community builder here in this neighborhood.
I actually came to the neighborhood about 25 years ago as a youth pastor. There was a group of 3 churches in the neighborhood which had no children but decided to hire a youth pastor. And so my task was to reach out into the neighborhood to families that had teenagers and children and see how we could serve them. That was challenging, but also terrific fun. And in the process, I got to know the people of the neighborhood and really began to appreciate what a diverse and vital and interesting group of people they were. So I chose to, after that job changed, I chose to stay here in the neighborhood and to live here. Pastored a congregation for a while, but continued all through that time to really invest as much of my time and effort in making this a good place to live.
And I believe you still live in the Bates-Hendricks neighborhood. Can you brag about your neighborhood?
Yeah. I think one of the exciting moments for me was when I finally got to have the opportunity to be the president of one of our neighborhood associations, the Bates-Hendricks Neighborhood Association, and began to see what's possible when you assimilate the people who've been in the neighborhood for a long time with the new people that are coming in, the kind of urban pioneers who really want to live in the city, want the diversity of the city, like this kind of life. And what it means when you bring kind of those old timers and those new people together, and the synergy and energy that can happen in that can be really exciting. You have that stability and tradition, but you also have that vitality and creativity that comes with that new set of people.
I think it helps with a mutual respect for what each group brings into the community that they're working together there. So describe what is a community builder.
One of the fortunate things for our neighborhood has been that because we were well organized, a lot of outside groups, funders, the city, have seen us as a neighborhood with a lot of potential and possibility. They saw it as a place where they could bring resource, dollars, investment, and there would be people there to take it seriously. One of the things that developed out of that was the Greater Indianapolis Neighborhood Initiative. And what that allowed us to do was develop a quality of life plan where the neighborhood really gathered together and decided what's important, what are the things that are vital, what do we want to see happen. The other thing that happened during this period of time is the Annie Casey Foundation committed for 10 years to this neighborhood through what was called the Making Connections initiative. And it was another attempt to really get grassroots buy-in to the important issues in the neighborhood. So it spent a lot of time training neighborhood people to be leaders and facilitators, to organize in small groups, to study and research issues. So out of all of that, we began to talk about community building. And so community building is really the idea that what makes a great community is not just bricks and mortar. What makes a great community is when people work together on common concerns and interests. So when I was hired to be a community builder, in some sense, I was finally getting paid for what I'd done for years.
Yes.
And finally being allowed to spend all of my time on something that I tried to do in my spare time, which is simply to empower people, to identify those new leaders, to recognize when there are emerging concerns or obstacles, and call forth the real strengths and resources in this neighborhood to address them.
I understand that the quality of life plans that were formulated were about in 2006, say maybe 2007, in 6 different neighborhoods in Indianapolis. But how have you made that a living document rather than it being something on a shelf that has fond memories for people from back, 6+ years ago? So what methodology have you put into place now in this neighborhood?
One of the challenges when you live in a neighborhood for a long time and when you have multiple city administrations, when you have multiple funders who are interested in your neighborhood, is that each time a group comes, they want to start over. They want to sit around a table and talk about the same questions or the same problems or the same issues and develop a different plan. And I think in the course of my time here, we've probably done that maybe a dozen times for a dozen different entities. So I think what I'm excited about is in recent years, what we have finally developed, and some of this has been aided by technology, is to create a plan that's a living document. And so what we did is we took our quality of life plan and we put it on the internet, where anybody in the neighborhood can look at it, where they can see with commentary what the goals are and what's happening. They also can check to see what's complete, what's ongoing, and what's a failure. And then the last piece was inviting the neighborhood to gather 3 times a year in what we call a neighborhood congress, to really do 4 things. Celebrate the accomplishments, be able to say, wow, we said we were going to do that, and we did it. To acknowledge the failures, not always because we need to give up, but to figure out what's the new way, what's the new approach. To identify emerging concerns, because our world is changing rapidly, and the way that impacts our neighborhood is always new and different. And then finally, adopting some very specific actions, things that are measurable, things that we can hold ourselves accountable to, that we as a group want to accomplish.